Einstein, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist and one of the most brilliant scientific minds in history, left very specific instructions to have his body cremated after his death. He said, "Scatter the ashes secretly in order to discourage idolaters." He was well aware of his celebrity status and loathed the idea of being memorialized or studied. But on the night of April 17, 1955, he arrived at Princeton Hospital with a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm and died early the next morning. What happened next would set the course for a long and wild ride. The pathologist on the call the day Einstein died was Dr. Thomas Stoltz Harvey. He autopsied the body and, without direct instruction to do so, took the extra step of removing Einstein's brain, under the assumption that it would be studied. In what he thought would be a career-making move, he seized the opportunity and vowed to lead the study of Einstein's brain himself, to make a major professional contribution. So he preserved the brain in formaldehyde and took it home with him. Reporters quickly found out that he didn't have permission, nor any legal right to remove the brain or keep it for himself. When Einstein's son Hans Albert found out the next day, he was outraged. His father, a private and modest man, had left explicit instruction to cremate his body so as to not be exploited. This was exactly the kind of scandal he wanted to avoid, and yet somehow Harvey still managed to get permission, albeit reluctantly, from Hans Albert to keep the brain, though it was granted only on the condition that it be used for scientific research, and any results would be published in reputable scientific journals. It has been speculated that there were two possible reasons for Harvey to remove and keep the brain for himself. The first one was that at the request of Harry Zimmerman, Einstein's personal physician and professional mentor to Harvey, Zimmerman never publicly admitted this to be true, though he did make the request for the brain once it had been removed. The other possible theory is that perhaps Harvey was inspired by the study done on Lenin's brain in 1926 and simply got caught up in the moment, transfixed in the presence of greatness. Either way, he thought that removing Einstein's brain would change the course of his career and believed he was on the brink of a scientific discovery. Things didn't quite pan out that way though. Harvey was in way over his head. He was neither a neurosurgeon nor a brain specialist. His responsibility that day was to determine the cause of death, which was heart failure. There was no instruction to remove the brain or indicate that the brain would be studied. You can't blame the guy for thinking that it would be a loss to lose such an incredible brain. I mean, who wouldn't want to study the brain that came up with the theory of relativity, the photoelectric effect, and the concept of E equals mc squared? But you can't steal a brain and not expect some repercussions. Naturally, amid all the controversy surrounding the unauthorized removal of the brain, Harvey lost his job. So with the brain in tow, Harvey drove to Philadelphia, where there was a rare instrument called a microtome that could be used to section a brain. The team there carved the brain into 240 pieces and preserved it in celloidin, a gelatinous rubbery material. Other parts were preserved in slides, and a bit of the brain remained unsectioned. Harvey divvied up the pieces into 2 glass jars and stored them in his basement. For 2 decades, the brain sat there, with not one study published. Eventually, Harvey and the brain moved to the Midwest, settling in Wichita, Kansas in the mid-70s, where he worked as a medical supervisor in a biological testing lab and kept the brain in a cider box under a beer cooler. In 1978, a journalist named Stephen Levy, who worked for a regional magazine called the New Jersey Monthly, was given the assignment to find Einstein's brain. The editor of the magazine had read in a biography on Einstein that his body had been cremated except for his brain, which was kept for scientific research. But Einstein had been dead for 22 years, and no one had heard a thing about the brain since. Levy eventually tracked down Harvey in Wichita, and after a bit of persuasion, Harvey finally admitted that he still had the brain in his possession. Levy had found the brain. Harvey even showed him the brain down to the red Costa cider box he kept it in. After the article came out in the August 1978 edition of the magazine, the media went a little crazy. They camped out on Harvey's lawn. Levy had 2 solid days full of radio interviews. Johnny Carson even made a joke about it, and scientists finally took an interest. In 1984, Harvey sent 4 blocks of the brain to Dr. Marion Diamond, who worked at the University of California, Berkeley, at her request. Unfortunately, the fact that the brain tissue was preserved in celloidin meant that the methods of examination would be limited, and any experimental results would likely be flawed. In 1985, Harvey and collaborators from Dr. Diamond's study in California published the first study of Einstein's brain, claiming it had abnormal proportions of neurons and glial cells. The study was followed by 5 others reporting differences in individual cells, or in particular structures in Einstein's brain. The researchers behind these studies aimed to uncover the neurological underpinnings of intelligence. inventions. However, they have been largely discredited by modern science. In 1988, Harvey lost his medical license after failing a 3-day competency exam. He moved again, this time to Lawrence, Kansas, where he took a job on an assembly line in a plastic extrusion factory. He moved into a second-floor apartment next to a gas station and befriended his neighbor, the famed Beat Generation author William Burroughs. The two men regularly met for drinks on Burroughs' front porch. Harvey would tell stories about sending off pieces of the brain to researchers around the world. Burroughs would then boast to visitors that he could have a piece of Einstein anytime he wanted. In 1997, a young journalist named Michael Patroniti jumped at the opportunity for an exclusive and offered to drive Harvey and the brain to California. Harvey agreed, and a few days later he packed the famous brain into 2 plastic containers in a gray duffel bag, and they hit the road in a rented Buick Skylark. Patroniti even wrote a book about it called Driving Mr. Albert. After Harvey's death in 2007, the brain remained in the possession of Harvey's family until 2010, when they transferred what was left of the brain to the National Museum of Health and Medicine in Silver Spring, Maryland, including 14 photographs of the whole brain. There are bits and pieces of the brain that were never returned and are likely kept as curios. Although the scientific significance of Einstein's brain remains debatable, it's been culturally significant, spawning countless articles and stories, a play, a novel, and of course the controversy surrounding Harvey's reasons for keeping the brain largely to himself for 40 years, instead of handing it off to scientists who would be able to study it more thoroughly. You could chalk all this up to a sad ending for a great man whose scientific discoveries changed the world, or you could see this as a sign of a cultural fascination with greatness and our collective desire to understand what exactly makes a genius a genius. But as long as photos and memes of Einstein with his tongue out are getting circulated amongst us, he will continue to be a fascination among all us normal-brained folks. If you thought this video was interesting, I suggest you check out our even more interesting video, What Happened to the Man Who Got Hit with an Iron Rod Through His Head?